The morning sun filtered through Emma's bedroom window, casting long shadows across her walls decorated with faded Disney princess stickers. She was 7 years old, though recently she'd started feeling much older, older than she should be, older than any child should ever feel. Her small frame was curled beneath a pink comforter, and her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. She hadn't slept well in months. The nightmares came regularly now, dreams where her parents' angry voices morphed into monsters chasing her through endless hallways. Every night, she'd wake up gasping, her heart pounding like a caged bird desperate to escape. That's when Justice would appear, padding softly across the hardwood floor of her bedroom, his golden fur glowing in the moonlight. The dog would jump onto her bed, something usually discouraged but allowed on the nights when Emma couldn't stop trembling, and rest his warm head against her small chest. Somehow, feeling Justice's steady heartbeat against her own fractured one helped Emma breathe. She'd fall back asleep, her fingers tangled in his collar, as if holding onto him meant she could hold onto something solid in her rapidly disintegrating world. Today was Friday. Emma knew what Friday meant. It meant that in 6 hours her mother Sarah would arrive to pick her up for the weekend. It meant Emma had to be perfect. She had to smile at the right moments, laugh at the right jokes, and most importantly, she had to say the right things. The wrong words could trigger that look in her mother's eyes, a look of hurt and disappointment that made Emma feel like she'd done something unforgivable, even when she hadn't done anything wrong. She'd learned this lesson slowly over the past 18 months, ever since her parents separated. At first, she hadn't understood. She remembered when her father had quietly told her that he and her mother wouldn't be living together anymore, that it wasn't anyone's fault, that both of them loved her very much. Emma had believed him then. She'd thought the divorce would be the worst thing that could happen. She was wrong. Things had changed gradually at first, then all at once. Her mother would pick her up for custody weekends and immediately ask questions. Did Dad take you anywhere fun? Did he buy you new things? Did he talk about me? Emma had answered honestly at first, but she quickly learned that honesty wasn't always welcome. When she mentioned having ice cream with her father at her favorite shop, her mother's face had clouded over. He's trying to buy your love, Sarah had said quietly, her voice trembling with what Emma now recognized as anger, though at the time Emma had thought it was sadness. He doesn't care about you the way I do, Emma. A real parent doesn't try to bribe their child. Emma had felt a knot of confusion tighten in her stomach. She'd only wanted ice cream. She hadn't thought it meant anything bad about her father. Comments had continued and intensified. Your father forgot your birthday last year when you were with him, her mother had whispered one night, conveniently forgetting that Emma's birthday fell on a day when she was scheduled to be with her mother. He probably didn't even remember you existed. The words had burrowed into Emma's mind like parasites, twisting and growing. She'd started testing her father, asking him questions designed to confirm her mother's accusations. Do you love me, Dad? She'd ask, searching his face for signs of the indifference her mother had described. Confused by the sudden insecurity from his usually confident daughter, would pull her close and assure her repeatedly that he loved her more than anything in the world. But there was something in the way her mother had said those things, so certain, so specific, that made Emma doubt his words even as he spoke them. The psychological toll had been subtle at first, then devastating. Emma started having stomachaches during her custody weekends with her father. She'd wake up with headaches. Her appetite disappeared. At school, her teacher Mrs. had mentioned to that Emma seemed withdrawn, that she'd stopped raising her hand in class and preferred to sit alone at lunch. Had noticed too. He'd seen his once bright, chattering daughter transform into a quiet ghost of herself. The change had alarmed him enough that he'd secretly scheduled a consultation with Dr., a child psychologist specializing in custody disputes and parental alienation. When he described his concerns to her, Doctor had gone very quiet. Then she'd asked him a series of questions, many of which made him feel defensive and guilty, even though he knew he hadn't done anything wrong. Does she show signs of anxiety when transitioning between households? Has she expressed loyalty conflicts, statements like you don't want me if I love my mother? Does she seem to seek reassurance about your feelings for her repeatedly? Had answered yes to every question, his heart sinking with each affirmation. Doctor had explained the concept of parental alienation, how one parent could systematically undermine a child's relationship with the other parent, how the child could be weaponized in adult conflicts, how the damage to the child's psyche could be profound and long-lasting. She described conditions Emma shouldn't have to experience: constant tension, impossible loyalty conflicts, the loss of a parent without death, the internalization of adult anger and hurt. Most devastatingly, she'd explained how children often couldn't articulate what was happening to them. They internalized it, blamed themselves, and became trapped in silence. That's when Doctor had introduced the idea of justice. She'd explained that Emma might be too frightened to speak the truth directly, too conditioned to protect her mother's feelings, too confused about what was real and what was manipulation. But a trained dog, a dog that could be taught to recognize Emma's distress signals and respond visibly, might be able to communicate what Emma couldn't. It had seemed impossible at first, but was desperate. His daughter was suffering, and he had no way to prove it, no way to protect her. So he'd agreed to the unconventional plan. Justice had come into their lives a year ago as a puppy, an energetic ball of golden fur that Emma had immediately loved. The dog had become her constant companion, her safe place when everything else felt unsafe. Now, Justice was becoming something more: Emma's voice, her truth-teller, her bridge to freedom. Over the past 3 months, Emma and Justice had been working with Doctor in secret sessions held at home when Emma returned from school. They'd practiced signals, a specific blink pattern, a touch to Justice's ear, a particular whistle, each one designed to trigger a trained response in the dog. Justice had learned to recognize the physical manifestations of Emma's emotional distress: her rapid heartbeat, her shallow breathing, her muscle tension. When Emma gave the signal, Justice would respond with visible anxiety behaviors: packing, whining, alert posture, that would broadcast Emma's hidden fear to observers. Now, on this Friday morning, as Emma lay in bed listening to the sounds of her father making breakfast downstairs, she knew that today everything might change. Tonight, Justice would spend the evening with her mother as part of the normal custody arrangement. And tonight, for the first time, Emma would use their secret signal. In 3 days, there would be a custody hearing. In 3 days, Justice might help Emma finally tell the truth. As Emma climbed out of bed and dressed in the clothes her mother preferred, sensible, modest, safe, she felt a strange mixture of terror and hope. Justice followed her downstairs, his tail wagging, unaware that his purpose was about to be revealed. Emma wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur. "Help me tell them, Justice," she whispered. "Please help me tell them what's really happening." Judge Robert Harrison sat in his private chambers at the courthouse, the morning light casting his weathered face in shades of gray. At 63 years old, he had presided over the family court for 30 years, 3 decades of watching marriages crumble, watching families tear themselves apart, and worst of all, watching children caught in the crossfire of their parents' war. He thought he'd seen everything: the affairs, the abuse, the financial manipulation, the bitter custody battles that raged for years. He had developed a thick skin necessary for this work, an emotional armor that allowed him to make decisions that would destroy families while maintaining his judicial composure. Yet somehow, no matter how many cases he saw, the cases involving children always managed to penetrate that armor, leaving marks that didn't quite fade away. The file on his desk was thicker than most, and Sarah's case had already consumed 43 hours of court time over 18 months. The initial separation had been relatively amicable, papers signed, assets divided, a temporary custody arrangement established. But somewhere along the way, things had deteriorated into the kind of bitter warfare that Judge Harrison dreaded. He had read through the accusations multiple times that morning, each time feeling a growing sense of frustration and concern. His allegations were detailed and damaging. He claimed that Sarah had been systematically poisoning Emma's mind against him, telling the child lies about his character, his level of care, his commitment to her. According to the affidavit, Sarah had told Emma that real fathers don't work late. Real fathers pick their daughters up on time every single day. Real fathers don't forget important details about their child's life. Had included a list of specific incidents, times when he'd been late picking up Emma due to work emergencies, times when he'd confused details about her school projects because he was exhausted from back-to-back shifts. Sarah had weaponized these normal human failures into proof that he didn't love his daughter. But Sarah's allegations were equally compelling. She claimed that was using money and material possessions to buy Emma's affection, creating an unhealthy dynamic where love was transactional. She stated that's work schedule made him an unreliable parent, that he frequently canceled custody time to attend meetings or travel for his job. She alleged that he'd been spotted at a bar with another woman, which she claimed was evidence of his poor character and his inability to model appropriate behavior for a 7-year-old girl. She'd included testimony from a neighbor claiming to have seen argue with Emma in his car, his voice raised, his hand gesturing angrily. No witnesses to the context, no understanding of what the argument was about, but the implication was clear. She was portraying him as volatile and potentially abusive. Judge Harrison had read both affidavits and felt the familiar tension headache beginning to build at the base of his skull. Neither allegation seemed particularly well supported by concrete evidence. The neighbor's testimony was hearsay and potentially biased. Sarah's characterization of work ethic as evidence of poor parenting was subjective. Allegations about Sarah's comments were based on Emma's reports, which was how most custody disputes were complicated. Children were often the only witnesses, and their testimonies were inherently unreliable, filtered through their own confusion and emotional turmoil. The judge had ordered a psychological evaluation of both parents and an independent custody evaluation conducted by a licensed social worker. Both assessments had come back remarkably neutral. The evaluator noted that both and Sarah appeared to love their daughter genuinely. Both had stable housing, stable employment, and no records of abuse or criminal activity. Both presented themselves well in interviews. The psychologist had recommended joint custody with a slightly higher percentage of time with, noting that Emma seemed to show more anxiety during transitions between households, which suggested she might benefit from more stability with one primary residence. But the psychologist had also noted something concerning in her observations. Emma exhibited inconsistent attachment patterns and signs of emotional distress related to loyalty conflicts. The report stated, "This child appears to be managing competing demands and feelings of divided loyalty that are creating significant internal stress." This was the real issue, Judge Harrison knew. This was the invisible damage that custody battles inflicted on children. It didn't matter who was right or wrong in the parental conflict. The damage came from the conflict itself, from forcing a 7-year-old to navigate impossible emotional terrain, from making her feel like she had to choose between two people she loved. The judge's phone buzzed. His clerk informed him that the courtroom would be ready in an hour, that the attorneys had already arrived and were reviewing their files in the conference areas. Judge Harrison gathered the case file, along with copies of the psychological evaluations and the custody assessment. He placed them in a leather folder, taking a moment to steel himself for what was coming. What troubled him most was the unusual request that had been filed by his attorney. She had submitted a motion requesting that Emma's emotional support animal, a golden retriever named Justice, be allowed in the courtroom during her testimony. The motion included a letter from a doctor, a licensed clinical psychologist, explaining that Emma's anxiety would be better managed with her comfort animal present. The letter was notably vague about Justice's specific role, mentioning only that the dog was trained to provide emotional support and stabilizing presence during times of stress. Judge Harrison had initially been skeptical. Animals in the courtroom were unusual, and he preferred to maintain formal decorum. but he'd consulted with his colleague Judge Williams, who had allowed therapy dogs in custody cases before. She'd explained that children often better with emotional support animals present, that their anxiety decreased, that they were more likely to communicate openly. She'd also mentioned that some support animals were trained to do more than simply provide comfort. Some were trained to alert to emotional episodes or panic attacks. The judge had approved the request, though he remained uncertain about the full implications. Now, sitting alone in his chambers with the case file before him, Judge Harrison found himself wondering what he was missing. There was something about this case that felt different from the dozens of other custody disputes he'd adjudicated. Both attorneys seemed unusually committed, unusually invested. Attorney had been particularly persistent about certain details, asking Judge Harrison multiple times if there were any flexibility in the hearing schedule, if there was any way to expedite the process. Sarah's attorney, conversely, had been trying to delay, filing continuance requests, requesting additional evaluations. The judge closed his eyes for a moment, thinking about Emma. He'd seen her once briefly, when the court-ordered custody evaluator had brought her to the courthouse for a preliminary hearing 6 months ago. She'd been a small, quiet girl with pale hair and worried eyes that tracked every adult in the room. He'd noticed how she seemed to flinch when her mother entered the courtroom, how she'd immediately looked to her father for reassurance. He'd also noticed how deliberately she'd kept her gaze away from both parents during the hearing itself, as if looking at either one might trigger something catastrophic. Judge Harrison stood up and walked to the window overlooking the courthouse steps. Below, he could see people arriving for various hearings, lawyers in expensive suits, parents filled with anxiety and determination, social workers carrying bulky files. Somewhere in that crowd was a 7-year-old girl who would soon have to take the stand and talk about her life, her parents, her feelings. And somehow, her golden retriever was going to be part of this process, in a way that Judge Harrison didn't quite understand. He glanced back at the case file, then at the letter from Doctor. Something about this case was about to reveal itself. He could feel it in his bones, that instinctive understanding that comes with decades of experience. Justice, the dog and the concept, was about to arrive in his courtroom in a way he had never anticipated. The judge took a deep breath, gathered his robes, and prepared to enter the courtroom. He had no idea what was about to unfold, but he knew it would be significant. He could only hope that whatever happened, Emma would survive it intact. Emma's hands were shaking so badly that she could barely hold the Bible as the bailiff administered the oath. Her voice, when she repeated the words, came out in a whisper so faint that Judge Harrison had to lean forward to hear her. "I do solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God." The words felt impossible. The truth. Emma wanted to tell the truth, had been planning to tell the truth, but now that she was here, sitting in this enormous chair in front of so many people, the truth felt like a living thing trapped in her chest, clawing to get out but unable to break through the wall of fear she'd constructed around it. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of the air conditioning unit humming in the corner. Emma could see her father sitting on the left side of the gallery, his face pale and drawn, his attorney beside him looking confident and professional. On the right side sat her mother, Sarah, with her own attorney, a man with sharp features and sharper eyes who had shaken Emma's hand before the hearing and told her to just be honest. The irony of that statement wasn't lost on Emma. Being honest was the one thing she couldn't do, not in front of her mother, not when her mother was watching her with those intense blue eyes that seemed to look right through Emma's carefully constructed facade. Justice sat beside Ms., the court-appointed advocate for children, who had been Emma's support person throughout this entire ordeal. The dog was calm, his head resting on his paws, but Emma could see the tension in his muscles, the way his ears perked up slightly whenever anyone raised their voice. Justice could feel it too, the emotional charge in the room, the weight of all these adult problems pressing down on one small child. Judge Harrison began with gentle questions, his voice deliberately soft and non-threatening. He was an experienced judge, and he knew that children better when they felt safe, when they weren't being attacked or interrogated. "Hello, Emma. How are you feeling today?" he asked with a kindness that made something in Emma's chest twist. She wanted to tell him the truth right now. She wanted to say, "I'm terrified, and my mother has been telling me horrible things about my dad, and I don't know what's real anymore, and I can't breathe properly because I'm so anxious all the time." Instead, she said, "I'm okay." The lie came out easily. She'd been practicing it for so long now, these small lies, these acceptable untruths that kept the peace and prevented the terrible consequences of honesty. Judge Harrison smiled, but Emma noticed something in his expression, a slight narrowing of his eyes, a recognition that something wasn't quite right. He asked her about school, about her favorite subjects, about what she liked to do for fun. Emma answered in one-word responses when possible, longer sentences when necessary. With each answer, she felt the knot in her stomach tightening further. Then Sarah's attorney stood up for cross-examination. He was a tall man with a booming voice that filled the courtroom, and Emma's first instinct was to shrink away. He smiled at her in what he probably thought was a reassuring way, but it made her feel even smaller, even more vulnerable. "Emma, you love your mother very much, don't you?" he asked, his tone suggesting that this was a statement, not a question. Emma nodded, "Yes." "And your mother loves you very much, doesn't she?" Another nod, "Yes." "Your mother takes good care of you, doesn't she? She makes sure you eat healthy food, do your homework, get to bed on time." Emma hesitated for just a fraction of a second too long. Her mother did do these things, but she also did other things. She said things. She made Emma feel things that children shouldn't feel. But how could Emma explain that? How could she say that love and harm could exist in the same person in the same moment? "Yes," Emma said quietly. The attorney continued, leading her through a series of questions designed to paint her mother in the best possible light. He asked about times her father had been late picking her up, times he'd canceled plans, times he'd seemed tired or irritable. With each question, Emma felt her father's eyes on her, and she wanted to die. She was betraying him without meaning to. The attorney was putting words in her mouth, was constructing a narrative that made her father sound neglectful, uncaring. Then's attorney stood up. She was a younger woman with kind eyes, and Emma felt a small surge of hope. Maybe she would ask questions that would allow Emma to tell the real truth. "Emma, how do you feel when you're with your father?" she asked. Emma thought about this carefully. The answer was complicated. When she was with her father, she felt safe. She felt loved. But she also felt guilty because her mother had told her that if she was happy with her father, that meant she didn't love her mother. So she'd learned to be less happy, to dampen her joy, to keep part of herself locked away even in her father's home. "It's good," Emma said carefully. "Can you tell me what makes it good?" Emma looked at her father. He was leaning forward slightly, his jaw tense, his hands clasped tightly together. She could see the hope in his face, the desperate need for her to validate him, to confirm that he was a good father. And she did think that. But she was also terrified. What if saying good things about her father made her mother angry? What if her mother her love again? Emma had experienced that punishment before. The silent treatment that could last for days. The emotional coldness that made Emma feel like she was disappearing. He takes me places. We do things together. He reads to me at bedtime," Emma said, the words coming out robotic and rehearsed. "Does your father ever say mean things about your mother to you?" "No," Emma said, and this was true. Her father had been remarkably restrained, never once Sarah to Emma, even though Emma knew he was suffering because of her mother's actions. "Does your mother ever say mean things about your father to you?" The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. This was the moment. This was where Emma could tell the truth. But when she looked at her mother's face, she saw something that made her hesitate. Her mother was leaning forward slightly, and Emma could see the slight tension in her jaw, the way her mother's hands were gripping the edge of the table. Emma understood that look. It meant her mother was stressed, upset. It meant that anything Emma said that disappointed her mother would have consequences. No, Emma lied. Mom doesn't say mean things. She felt Justice shift beside her, as if the dog sensed the falsity of the statement. The dog's ears perked up, and Emma could see Judge Harrison watching the reaction. But the moment passed. The attorney moved on to other questions. Emma answered them all as best she could, each answer a carefully calibrated lie designed to keep everyone happy and keep Emma safe, even though safety was the one thing she actually didn't have. When she was finally excused from the stand, Emma felt hollowed out, as if all of her insides had been scooped away and replaced with emptiness. She had been given a chance to tell the truth, and she had failed. She had failed her father. She had failed herself. She had failed everyone who was trying to help her. As she walked back to her seat, Justice's presence was the only thing keeping her from completely falling apart. She touched the dog's head gently, and Justice leaned against her leg. The dog had been waiting for her signal, but she hadn't given it. Not yet. She had been too afraid. Judge Harrison watched this interaction with keen interest. His decades of experience told him that something significant had just happened, or rather, something significant had failed to happen. The child had clearly been holding something back. Her testimony had been rehearsed, her answers too perfect, her emotional responses too controlled for a 7-year-old under stress. There was a disconnect between what Emma was saying and what her body language was communicating. The judge made a note on his legal pad. Child's testimony inconsistent with body language indicators, possible coaching or intimidation. The courtroom was taking a recess. Judge Harrison had called for a 15-minute break after Emma's testimony, much to everyone's confusion. The attorneys had exchanged glances, uncertain why the judge needed a pause when both sides had essentially finished their questioning. But Judge Harrison knew that he needed time to think, to process what he'd observed. Something was wrong with Emma's testimony, fundamentally wrong in a way that transcended the usual inconsistencies found in custody cases. He had excused himself to his chambers, leaving the courtroom in a state of anxious waiting. Emma sat in the hallway outside the courtroom with Ms. and Justice. Her body felt like it had been electrified and then drained of all energy simultaneously. She was shaking, despite the warm temperature of the courthouse hallway. The fluorescent lights overhead felt too bright, too harsh. She could hear her mother's voice from the other side of the courtroom doors, speaking to her attorney in hushed, urgent tones. Her father's voice was quieter, more controlled, but Emma could detect the strain in it. Miss squeezed Emma's hand gently. "You did so well in there, sweetie. You were very brave." Emma wanted to scream. She hadn't been brave. She had been terrified and dishonest and completely ineffective at communicating anything real about her situation. The weight of her failure pressed down on her like a physical force. She looked at Justice, and the dog looked back at her with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to understand everything about her emotional state. This was it. This was the moment she was supposed to use their signal. This was the moment Justice could speak for her when she couldn't speak for herself. But the courtroom doors suddenly opened, and Judge Harrison emerged, his expression unreadable. He gestured for everyone to return to the courtroom. The 15-minute recess had been cut short to only 5 minutes. Something had changed. Something about the judge's demeanor had shifted into something sharper, more focused. As Emma walked back into the courtroom with Ms. and Justice, she felt the moment approaching like a storm on the horizon. This was the point of no return. Once she gave the signal, there would be no taking it back. Justice would react, and everyone would see. Her mother would see. The thought made Emma's throat constrict so tightly that she could barely breathe. Emma slid back into the seat next to Ms., and Justice immediately settled at her feet, his head resting against her leg in that way that had become so familiar and comforting over the past months of training. Judge Harrison was reviewing his notes, his face a mask of judicial professionalism, but Emma could sense something different in his energy. It was as if he had figured something out during those 5 minutes in his chambers, as if some critical piece of a puzzle had suddenly clicked into place in his mind. Emma's hands trembled in her lap. Around her, the courtroom was settling back into order. The court reporter was at her station, fingers poised over the keyboard. The bailiff stood at attention. Both sets of attorneys were reviewing their files. Her mother was looking directly at Emma, and when their eyes met, Emma saw something in her mother's expression that made her heart skip. It was a warning. It was a reminder of all the ways her mother could hurt her if she didn't continue to play this game correctly. Emma closed her eyes for a moment and thought about what Doctor had told her during their sessions. You deserve to be safe, Emma. You deserve to have people who love you without conditions. You deserve to tell the truth. Doctor's words had become a mantra that Emma repeated to herself on the hardest days, the days when her mother's love felt more like a weapon than a gift. Then Judge Harrison looked at Emma directly, and in that moment something shifted. The judge's eyes held a kind of understanding that Emma hadn't seen in any adult's eyes before. It was as if he could see through all of her lies, all of her protective mechanisms, and could recognize the terrified child underneath. It was as if he was silently telling her, I know something is wrong. I know you're not telling the truth. And I'm giving you permission to tell it now, in whatever way you can. Emma's hands began to move almost of their own accord. She had practiced this signal so many times with Doctor and Justice that her body could do it even when her mind was screaming in fear. She took a deep breath, centered herself, and looked at Justice. The dog's ears perked up immediately, recognizing the pre-signal tension. Emma's fingers moved to her left ear. She blinked rapidly 3 times while touching the dog's head, the signal they had rehearsed endlessly. For a moment, nothing happened. Emma felt her heart drop. Had Justice forgotten? Had the dog not heard the signal? Had everything failed before it even started? Then Justice stood up. But this wasn't the calm, controlled standing of a dog simply changing positions. This was an alert stand, a defensive posture. The dog's body immediately became rigid, his ears fully erect, his eyes intense and focused. He turned his head directly towards Sarah, Emma's mother, and his body language shifted into something that could only be described as protective alarm. Justice began packing in tight, agitated circles around Sarah's position, his breathing audible, his movements jerky, and the dog was broadcasting distress and warning in a way that was unmistakable to anyone who understood animal behavior. The courtroom erupted. Sarah's attorney jumped to his feet immediately, objecting strenuously. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The dog is disrupting the proceedings. This is exactly why animals shouldn't be in courtrooms. But Judge Harrison's hand shot up, silencing everyone with an authority that was absolute and commanding. Silence. Everyone sit down, now. The sharpness in his voice was enough to make even the experienced attorneys comply instantly. Sarah's attorney sat down, his face flushing with indignation. Judge Harrison's eyes never left Emma and Justice. The judge's expression had transformed into something that could only be described as shock followed by crystalline clarity. His entire body had gone still, and for a long moment he simply stared at the dog and the child. Emma watched the judge's face, and she saw the exact moment when understanding arrived. She saw his eyebrows rise slightly. She saw his jaw tighten. She saw his hand move to his chest as if his heart had just skipped a beat. The judge looked from Justice to Emma, then to Sarah, then back to Justice. And in that moment, Judge Robert Harrison, with 30 years of judicial experience, understood the entire truth of the situation in a way that no amount of testimony could have revealed. Justice wasn't acting out randomly or being disruptive. Justice was communicating. The dog's behavior was a trained response to Emma's distress signal. The dog was saying without words what Emma was too terrified to say. This child is in distress. This child is afraid. This child has been hurt. Judge Harrison's face went pale. He set down his pen very carefully. He looked at Emma with an expression that contained multitudes, pity, anger, recognition of a truth that had been hidden in plain sight. Then he looked at Sarah, and his expression hardened into something cold and judgmental. We're taking a recess, he said quietly. A proper recess. 1 hour. I need to speak with the child's psychologist and the child's advocate in my chambers. Now. As Judge Harrison stood and exited the courtroom, his black robes flowing behind him like wings, Emma felt something shift deep inside her chest. It was relief. It was hope. It was the beginning of the possibility that she might finally be free to tell the truth. Justice pressed against her leg and Emma bent down to hug the dog, burying her face in his golden fur. For the first time in 18 months, Emma cried, not the silent, hidden tears she cried at night, but real, honest tears of release and gratitude. She had done it. She had given the signal. She had let justice speak for her, and somehow, against all odds, someone had finally understood. Judge Harrison's chambers were a sanctuary of leather-bound legal books, mahogany furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the courthouse plaza. It was a room designed to convey authority and wisdom, but right now it felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. The judge sat behind his massive desk, his black robes draped over the back of his chair, his tie loosened slightly. He hadn't felt this unsettled in years. His hands, which rarely trembled, were shaking as he reviewed his notes from the courtroom. He had called for Ms. and Dr. within minutes of his recess announcement. He had also requested that Emma remain in his private office with a bailiff present, separate from both parents. The child needed protection, and Judge Harrison was beginning to understand just how much danger Emma was actually in. Not physical danger, but psychological danger that could be just as destructive. When Ms. entered the chambers first, Judge Harrison closed the door behind her and gestured for her to sit. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. That dog wasn't having a panic attack or random anxiety episode, was it? He asked bluntly. That was a trained response, a deliberate trained response to something Emma did. Ms.'s face flushed. She glanced at the door, clearly considering whether she should answer, clearly aware that she was walking into territory that might be legally problematic. But the judge's expression left no room for evasion. This was a man used to getting answers, and his authority in his own chambers was absolute. I can't discuss the specifics of Emma's therapeutic plan without her father's consent, Ms. said carefully. That information is protected under confidentiality agreements related to her mental health treatment. Then get his consent, Judge Harrison said. Call his attorney. Do it now. Because what I just witnessed in that courtroom suggests that there's evidence relevant to this custody case, and I need to understand what that evidence is. 20 minutes later, Saturni had given verbal consent for Ms. to discuss Emma's psychological treatment plan with the judge. Doctor arrived shortly after, carrying a leather portfolio that contained months of documentation. She was a woman in her 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and the composed demeanor of someone used to delivering difficult truths. Judge Harrison gestured for both women to sit across from his desk. Explain, he said simply. Doctor took a breath. Your Honor, approximately 8 months ago, Mitchell brought his daughter to my office because he was concerned about her emotional state. Emma was exhibiting signs of severe anxiety, depression, and what appeared to be emotional abuse related to her custody situation. During my evaluations, Emma disclosed that her mother had been engaging in parental alienation behaviors, systematically undermining her relationship with her father through false statements, emotional manipulation, and conditional love. What kind of false statements? Judge Harrison asked, his legal mind cataloging every detail. Sarah had told Emma that her father didn't love her, that he was using money to buy her affection, that he was irresponsible and unreliable. She created a narrative in which Emma had to choose between her parents, and she used emotional withdrawal as punishment whenever Emma showed affection toward her father. Emma was living in a constant state of anxiety about disappointing her mother. Judge Harrison felt his jaw tighten. This was classic parental alienation, textbook emotional abuse of a child. He'd seen it before, but it was still infuriating every single time. How did you arrive at the solution of training a dog? He asked. Doctor exchanged a glance with Ms. before continuing. Emma was too frightened to speak the truth openly. She'd been conditioned to protect her mother's feelings, to suppress her own emotions, and to prioritize maintaining her mother's love at any cost. Traditional therapy was progressing slowly because Emma couldn't articulate her experiences without severe anxiety. She kept reverting to the narrative her mother had instilled in her. "So you trained a dog to speak for her," Judge Harrison said, understanding dawning in his mind. "We trained a dog to alert to her distress signals," Doctor corrected gently. Justice was taught to recognize specific physical manifestations of Emma's emotional trauma: her elevated heart rate, her muscle tension, her shallow breathing patterns. When Emma gives a trained signal, Justice responds with obvious behavioral indicators of distress. The dog essentially broadcasts what Emma is feeling when she cannot speak it herself. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, processing this information. From a legal standpoint, this was highly unconventional. From a psychological standpoint, it was creative and potentially brilliant. From a practical standpoint, it had just worked exactly as intended. Justice's behavior in the courtroom had communicated something that hours of testimony never could have achieved. "Is this methodology recognized in the psychological community?" the judge asked. "It's emerging research," Doctor admitted. "There are similar programs being used in trauma therapy and PTSD treatment. What we did with Justice is a relatively new application, but the principle is sound. We essentially gave Emma a voice when her own voice was too compromised by fear to be reliable." Judge Harrison stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the courthouse plaza. Below, people were coming and going, completely unaware of the significance of what was happening in his chambers. "I need to see the documentation," he said. "All of it. Every therapy session, every observation, every detail of Justice's training." Doctor opened her portfolio and laid out months of meticulously organized files. There were session notes detailing Emma's disclosures, psychological assessments showing her anxiety and trauma symptoms, training logs documenting Justice's conditioning, video recordings of practice sessions, and medical documentation showing the physical manifestations of Emma's stress responses. Judge Harrison read through the materials systematically, his legal training allowing him to absorb information quickly. What emerged was a clear, comprehensive picture of a child being systematically emotionally abused by her mother. The documentation showed Emma's statements about her mother's comments: "Daddy doesn't really love me. Daddy is too busy to care about me. If you love Daddy, you're betraying me." Psychological assessments showing depression, anxiety, and trauma responses comparable to children who had experienced more overt forms of abuse. Medical records indicating Emma's stress responses: elevated cortisol levels, sleep disturbances, stomach issues, all consistent with chronic psychological stress. Training logs showing Justice learning to alert to Emma's physical stress signals through consistent, positive reinforcement. Most damaging of all were the audio recordings from therapy sessions where Emma, speaking in the safety of Doctor's office, had made specific allegations about her mother's behavior. In those recordings, Emma's voice was small and hesitant, but her words were clear and consistent. She described her mother's exact statements, the timing of emotional withdrawal, the consequences Emma had learned to expect if she showed too much happiness with her father. One particular recording made Judge Harrison's hands clench into fists. In it, Emma was describing how her mother had told her, "Your daddy forgot you existed when he left us. He doesn't call you because he doesn't care. Real daddies would call every single day, but he doesn't. That's because you're not important to him." The judge had to take a moment to control his breathing. This was calculated, deliberate psychological abuse. This was a parent weaponizing a child's need for parental love and security in order to punish the other parent. "Has Sarah been confronted with this evidence?" Judge Harrison asked. "No," Ms. said. "This documentation has been kept confidential as part of Emma's therapeutic record. The attorney was aware of the general conclusions, but the full scope of the evidence has been protected under medical confidentiality. Judge Harrison nodded slowly. "This changes everything," he said quietly. He turned to face both women directly. "What I witnessed in that courtroom was justice communicating something that Emma couldn't communicate herself. That dog's behavior was a direct response to a trained signal, and that signal was Emma's way of saying, 'This is real, this is true, believe me.' And frankly, doctor, based on the documentation you've provided, I believe her completely." "Your Honor," doctor said carefully, "I should note that while Justice's response in court was effective, it may not be admissible as evidence in the traditional sense. The dog is not a witness. The signal could be challenged as coaching or manipulation of the child." Judge Harrison held up his hand. "The dog's behavior is not the evidence. The dog was simply a catalyst that allowed me to see what should have been obvious to me from the beginning. The real evidence is sitting in my office. It's the documentation you've provided. It's the recordings. It's Emma's statements to you as her treating psychologist. It's the medical evidence of her stress responses. It's the comprehensive picture of a child being systematically harmed by one parent." He paused, his expression hardening. "And frankly, it's also justice, because that dog just demonstrated something that transcends traditional legal evidence. That dog just demonstrated that Emma was telling the truth through her body language and her silence. The dog corroborated what Emma couldn't say with words." Judge Harrison walked back to his desk and picked up his pen. "I need you both to understand something. What happened in that courtroom today is going to be the turning point of this case, because I now have the evidence I need to understand what's really happening to that child. And I'm going to make sure that Emma's safety becomes the priority of this court, regardless of how unconventional the means by which I discovered the truth." He looked directly at Doctor. "I'm going to need you prepared to testify about your findings, all of them. Everything Emma disclosed, everything you observed. I'm going to need the recordings admitted into evidence. And I'm going to need you to explain to this court exactly what parental alienation is and what it does to a child's developing mind." Doctor nodded. "I'm prepared to do that, Your Honor." "Good," Judge Harrison said. He dismissed them both and sat alone in his chambers for several minutes, trying to process the magnitude of what he had learned. 30 years on the bench had taught him that truth often hid itself in unexpected places. Today, it had hidden itself in the body language of a dog and the silence of a child. And now, finally, that truth was about to come into the light. When Judge Harrison reconvened the courtroom, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The casual formality that typically characterized these proceedings had been replaced with something heavier, something charged with consequence. The judge's face was set in hard lines, his eyes sharp as flint. Emma sat in the gallery with Ms., and though she tried to sit still, her entire body was vibrating with nervous energy. Justice pressed against her leg, providing silent support. Sarah looked confused and slightly indignant. Her attorney had assured her that everything was proceeding well, that Emma's testimony had been sufficiently vague and noncommittal. He didn't seem to understand why the judge had suddenly called a recess, or why they were being subjected to what appeared to be an emergency hearing rather than following the normal schedule. Judge Harrison made his announcement with the force of a gavel striking. "We will now hear testimony from Doctor, the clinical psychologist who has been treating Emma Mitchell. Doctor will provide expert testimony regarding her clinical observations and findings in this case. This is outside the normal order of proceedings, but I have determined that this testimony is critical to reaching a just outcome in this matter." Sarah's attorney stood up immediately. "Your Honor, I object. We have not been provided adequate notice of this witness. This is highly irregular. We need time to prepare for cross-examination." Judge Harrison's expression didn't soften. "Your objection is noted and overruled. Doctor has been available as an expert in this case from the beginning. You have had adequate opportunity to request her testimony during the discovery phase. That you chose not to do so is not the court's problem. Proceed." Doctor walked to the witness stand with the composed demeanor of someone who had in court many times before. She was sworn in, and Judge Harrison began his examination with methodical precision. "Doctor, how long have you been treating Emma Mitchell?" "Approximately 8 months, Your Honor." "And in your professional capacity as a clinical psychologist, what are your observations regarding Emma's psychological state?" Doctor took a measured breath. Emma presented with significant symptoms of anxiety, depression, and trauma. Her clinical presentation was consistent with emotional abuse and what we call parental alienation, a situation where one parent systematically undermines a child's relationship with the other parent through manipulation and psychological harm. The courtroom fell silent. The words emotional abuse and parental alienation hung in the air like a bell that had just been struck. "Can you explain what parental alienation is in layman's terms?" Judge Harrison asked. "Certainly," Doctor said, her voice calm and professional. "Parental alienation occurs when one parent deliberately damages their child's relationship with the other parent. It's done through false statements, emotional manipulation, creating situations where the child must choose between parents, and often through conditional love, withdrawing affection or approval when the child shows loyalty to the other parent. It's a form of psychological abuse because it damages the child's sense of security, identity, and emotional." "And you observed these symptoms in Emma?" "Yes, extensively," Doctor said. She pulled out her clinical notes. Emma exhibited hypervigilance in her mother's presence, constant monitoring of her mother's emotional state to anticipate potential rejection. She demonstrated compulsive people-pleasing behaviors, excessive compliance, difficulty articulating her own needs or preferences. She had elevated anxiety levels specifically triggered by transitions between households. She reported depressive symptoms, including feelings of worthlessness and hopelessness. Most significantly, she disclosed a narrative that had been imposed on her by her mother. "What narrative?" Judge Harrison pressed. Doctor opened her notes and began to read directly from her session documentation. Emma stated that her mother had told her, "Your daddy doesn't love you like a real daddy should. He's too busy for you. If you love him, that means you don't love me. You have to choose who you really love, me or him." When Emma expressed affection for her father or recalled positive experiences with him, her mother would respond with emotional withdrawal. The silent treatment, refusal to engage with Emma, expressions of hurt and disappointment. Sarah's attorney stood up again. "Your Honor, this is hearsay. We're hearing statements that allegedly came from my client, filtered through the child, now being reported by this psychologist. This is highly prejudicial and inadmissible." Judge Harrison held up his hand. "Doctor is testifying as an expert regarding her clinical observations. These statements, as reported by her patient, are admissible in a custody proceeding to establish the clinical picture." Overruled. Doctor continued, her voice steady and unrelenting. "The impact on Emma has been significant. She has internalized the message that her father doesn't love her, despite objective evidence to the contrary. She has developed anticipatory anxiety about disappointing her mother. She has been unable to enjoy her time with her father without guilt. She has begun to show signs of learned helplessness, a belief that her emotional is completely dependent on her mother's approval." Doctor, in your professional opinion, what are the long-term consequences of this type of psychological abuse if it continues? Doctor looked directly at Sarah. If parental alienation continues unchecked, the consequences are severe. The child often develops chronic anxiety and depression. She may struggle with attachment and trust in her adult relationships. She may experience complex trauma symptoms. She may have difficulty forming a healthy sense of self because so much of her identity becomes tied to managing her parents' conflict. In some cases, the damage to the relationship with the targeted parent becomes irreversible. The courtroom had become incredibly still. Every person present understood the gravity of what was being described. This wasn't a disagreement between parents. This was psychological abuse of a child. Doctor, are you familiar with a service dog or emotional support animal trained to alert to the subject's distress signals? Doctor nodded. Yes. Justice was trained to recognize physical manifestations of Emma's emotional distress and to respond with obvious behavioral indicators. This was part of a therapeutic intervention designed to help Emma communicate her internal state when her voice was too compromised by fear to be reliable. And in your professional opinion, did Justice's response in this courtroom today accurately reflect Emma's emotional state? Absolutely, Doctor said without hesitation. Justice was alerting to Emma's severe anxiety and distress. The dog's response indicated that Emma was experiencing significant fear and psychological distress at that moment in the courtroom. And who was Justice alerting toward when he exhibited this behavior? Emma's mother, Doctor said clearly. Justice was trained to respond to Emma's internal distress, not external triggers. Justice was responding to Emma's emotional state as triggered by her mother's presence. Attorney rose to her feet. Your Honor, may I conduct a brief redirect to clarify the significance of this testimony? Judge Harrison nodded. Proceed. Doctor, in your professional opinion, based on all of your observations, clinical documentation, and assessment of Emma Mitchell, is there clear evidence that Emma has been subjected to emotional abuse and parental alienation by her mother? Yes, Doctor said firmly. The evidence is overwhelming and consistent across multiple clinical assessments, standardized psychological evaluations, and therapeutic sessions spanning 8 months. And in your professional opinion, is it safe for Emma to continue in her current custody arrangement with her mother? No, Doctor said, and her voice carried the weight of professional responsibility. Without immediate intervention and changes to the custody arrangement, I believe Emma's psychological will continue to deteriorate. Her mother's behavior, if continued, poses a significant risk to the child's mental health. Sarah suddenly made a sound, a small, choked cry of protest. Her face had gone pale during Doctor's testimony, and tears were streaming down her cheeks, but it was unclear whether the tears were from remorse or rage. Her attorney was whispering urgently in her ear, but Sarah wasn't listening. She was staring at Emma with an expression of wounded disbelief, as if she couldn't comprehend that her daughter had exposed her, had betrayed her, had told these awful lies about her. But they weren't lies, and somewhere deep inside Sarah knew it. Judge Harrison called for a brief recess, and the courtroom erupted. Whispers filled the space, observers exchanging shocked glances. The case had fundamentally shifted. What had been presented as a standard custody dispute had been revealed as something far more sinister: the systematic psychological abuse of a 7-year-old child by one of her parents. Emma watched her mother being led out of the courtroom by her attorney. Sarah's face was crumbling, her carefully maintained composure shattered. For just a moment, Emma felt a surge of something: sympathy, guilt, love. But then justice pressed against her leg, grounding her in the present moment, reminding her that what had just happened was necessary. What Doctor had said was true. Emma hadn't lied. The truth had finally been told. Judge Harrison returned to his bench, his jaw set, his eyes blazing with righteous anger at what he had just learned about the psychological abuse that had been inflicted on this child. He looked at Emma for just a moment, and there was something in his gaze that promised her justice, actual justice, not just the legal kind, but the kind that would protect her and validate her truth. The judge was ready to deliver his ruling, and when he did, it would reshape Emma's entire future. When Judge Harrison reconvened the courtroom after the recess, the energy had shifted into something solemn and consequential. Everyone understood that this was the moment when the judge would render his decision. Both attorneys had prepared their closing arguments. Those attorney looked confident while Sarah's attorney appeared to be bracing for impact. Judge Harrison entered with deliberate slowness, his black robe sweeping behind him like an avenging angel. He sat at his bench and arranged his papers with meticulous care, making everyone wait. The silence stretched out, heavy and pregnant with meaning. Emma sat in the gallery, her small hands folded in her lap, Justice's head resting against her leg. She was terrified and hopeful simultaneously, a contradiction that made her chest feel tight and strange. Finally, Judge Harrison looked up from his papers. His eyes swept across the courtroom, settling briefly on each key player before he began to speak. When he did, his voice was controlled but carrying an undercurrent of cold fury. "This case," he began, "presented itself as a standard custody dispute between two parents who both claim to love their daughter and both believe they are the more suitable custodial parent. However, the evidence presented to this court today has revealed something far more serious than a disagreement between divorced parents. This case involves the systematic psychological abuse of a 7-year-old child." Sarah's face crumpled. Her attorney placed a hand on her arm, but Sarah wasn't looking at him. She was staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. The testimony of Dr. combined with her clinical documentation spanning 8 months, presents clear and convincing evidence of parental alienation perpetrated by the mother, Sarah Mitchell. This court finds that Sarah Mitchell has deliberately and systematically undermined Emma's relationship with her father through false statements, emotional manipulation, and the of conditional love. Judge Harrison paused, his expression hardening further. The consequences of such behavior on a developing child are profound and potentially long-lasting. Emma Mitchell has internalized messages of rejection and unworthiness. She has been placed in an impossible position of having to choose between two parents. She has been taught that expressing love for one parent constitutes betrayal of the other. This is psychological abuse, and it will not be tolerated by this court. His hands had begun to shake. His attorney squeezed his shoulder but barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the judge, absorbing every word like a man receiving redemption. "Furthermore," Judge Harrison continued, "this court is deeply troubled by the fact that the mother has shown no remorse or insight into the harm she has caused. She has not acknowledged the impact of her actions on her daughter. Indeed, in conversations with her attorney, she has attempted to minimize and justify her behavior. This demonstrates a lack of insight that is concerning from a parental capacity standpoint." Sarah's attorney stood up. "Your Honor, with respect, my client has been given no opportunity to respond to these allegations in detail. This is highly prejudicial." "Sit down," Judge Harrison said, his voice cutting like a blade. "Your client had multiple opportunities to tell the truth. She chose not to do so. Now she will face the consequences of her choices." The attorney sat down immediately, recognizing that the judge's mind was made up and that further objections would only make things worse for his client. Judge Harrison opened his formal ruling document. "It is hereby ordered by this court that primary physical custody of Emma Mitchell is awarded to her father, Mitchell, effective immediately. The mother, Sarah Mitchell, shall have supervised visitation only, contingent upon her completion of the following requirements. 1. Intensive parenting counseling focused on healthy co-parenting and understanding the impact of parental alienation. 2. A comprehensive psychological evaluation conducted by a court-appointed psychologist to assess her capacity for change and her understanding of the harm she has caused. And 3. Documented evidence of her commitment to rebuilding a healthy relationship between Emma and her father." The judge set down his document and looked directly at Sarah. His expression was stern, almost prosecutorial. "Ms. Mitchell, I want you to understand something very clearly. You have caused profound harm to your daughter through your actions. Emma has had to develop psychological defense mechanisms to cope with the impossible situation you created. It will take years of therapeutic work for her to recover from what you have done." Sarah had begun crying openly now, her entire body shaking with sobs. Her attorney was whispering urgently, But Sarah wasn't listening. She seemed to have finally grasped the magnitude of her actions and their consequences. However, Judge Harrison continued, his tone shifting slightly to something that contained a particle of hope. This court believes that with genuine effort, psychological treatment, and demonstrated behavioral change, you may be able to rebuild some relationship with your daughter in the future. But that will require you to acknowledge what you have done, to take responsibility for it, and to commit yourself to genuine change. Supervised visitation will continue until this court is satisfied that you have completed these requirements and demonstrated sustained behavioral change. He then turned his attention to Mr. Mitchell. This court recognizes that you have been the victim of a coordinated campaign of parental alienation by your ex-wife. The evidence demonstrates that you have been a caring, involved father who has done nothing to deserve the treatment you have received. This court hopes that, with the restoration of primary custody, you can begin to rebuild your relationship with your daughter and help her process the trauma she has experienced. His eyes were streaming with tears, but his face held an expression of profound relief. Judge Harrison addressed the courtroom broadly. This case will serve as a reminder to all parents that the court takes parental alienation extremely seriously. Using a child as a weapon in adult conflict is not simply poor parenting, it is abuse, and it will not be tolerated. Any parent who engages in this behavior should understand that this court will intervene to protect the child, and the consequences for such behavior will be severe. He turned his attention to Emma, who was watching the proceedings with wide eyes. Emma, I want you to know that you were very brave today. What you did took courage that many adults would not possess. You told the truth, and because of your courage, this court is able to protect you and ensure that you are safe. You did not deserve to be put in the position you were in, but you have helped this court understand what was really happening, and now we can help you heal. Emma felt tears beginning to stream down her face, though she wasn't entirely sure if they were tears of relief or sadness or some complicated combination of both. Justice shifted beside her, pressing more firmly against her leg, as if the dog understood that this was the moment when everything changed. Judge Harrison's gavel came down with a decisive crack. This concludes these proceedings. The orders I have issued today are effective immediately. Child Protective Services will be of this ruling, and Emma's therapist will continue her psychological treatment at the expense of the defendant parent until such time as the court determines otherwise. The courtroom erupted into activity. Sarah's attorney was conferring with her urgently, discussing appeal options. His attorney was shaking his hand and patting him on the back. Court reporters were gathering their materials. Bailiffs were moving about, preparing the courtroom for the next case. But in the gallery, Emma sat very still, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. She was no longer going to be living between two worlds, no longer going to be forced to choose between her parents, no longer going to be managing her mother's emotional needs at the expense of her own. Had already moved to the gallery and was pulling Emma into his arms, holding her tightly, his whole body shaking with sobs of relief and validation. Emma buried her face in her father's chest and cried, not the silent, hidden tears she'd cried for so long, but real, honest tears of release and healing. Justice pressed against both of them, his tail wagging slowly, as if he too understood that the battle had been won and that a new chapter was beginning. The dog who had given voice to a voiceless child had accomplished his purpose. Justice, in both name and deed, had prevailed. Sarah watched from her seat, her face a mask of devastation, as she absorbed the reality of what she had lost. Her attorney was speaking to her, but the words seemed to bounce off her without landing. She had come to court that morning believing she had done nothing wrong, that her love for her daughter justified her actions, that she was the victim of an uncaring ex-husband. Now she was forced to face the truth. She had hurt the person she claimed to love most, and the court had determined that she was dangerous to her daughters. It was a reckoning that would take months, years even, for her to process. 6 months had passed since the courtroom hearing. Emma sat at the kitchen table in her house now, her primary residence, working on a watercolor painting for her art class. The sunlight streamed through the window, catching the golden highlights in Justice's fur as the dog napped beside her chair. Outside, the autumn leaves were beginning to turn, painting the world in shades of orange and gold. It was the kind of peaceful afternoon that Emma had never quite believed would exist for her. The nightmares had mostly stopped. They still came occasionally, triggered by unexpected sounds or by certain smells that reminded her of stressful moments, but they were no longer the nightly occurrence that had plagued her for so long. Doctor had explained that healing wasn't linear, that Emma might have difficult days, that recovery from trauma took time and patience. But Emma was beginning to believe that recovery was actually possible. Stood at the kitchen counter, preparing lunch. He moved with a lightness that hadn't been present before the custody ruling. The constant stress of not knowing whether he would lose his daughter had been replaced with something more grounded, the simple, profound relief of being able to parent his child without fear. He caught Emma's eye and smiled, and she smiled back, no longer worried that smiling too brightly at her father meant betraying her mother. The relationship with Sarah had remained complicated. The supervised visitation had begun 3 months after the ruling. The first few sessions had been awkward and emotionally charged. Sarah had cried, had apologized, had promised to change. But Emma had learned to be cautious with her mother's promises. The part of her that remained hypervigilant, the part that had been trained to manage her mother's emotions, had remained alert and guarded. However, something unexpected had happened. Sarah had taken the court's orders seriously. She had enrolled in an intensive parenting program that specialized in understanding the impact of parental alienation. She had the psychological evaluation, and the results had been sobering. The psychologist had diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder traits and had recommended intensive individual therapy to address her patterns of emotional manipulation and her difficulty with emotional regulation. More importantly, Sarah had begun to understand, truly understand, not just intellectually but emotionally, what she had done to her daughter. In her own therapy sessions, which were required by the court, she had started to confront the reality that her attempt to protect Emma from being hurt by her father had actually been her own attempt to protect herself. Sarah's own childhood had involved parental abandonment, and she had projected her fears onto Emma, trying to prevent her daughter from experiencing the same pain. But in doing so, she had inflicted a different kind of pain entirely. The supervised visitations had gradually become less supervised. After 5 months, with doctor's recommendation and cautious agreement, the court had modified the order to allow unsupervised visitation twice a month, with Sarah required to continue her therapy and to report her progress to the court annually. Sarah had not missed a single therapy session. She had not attempted to alienate Emma from her father. She had slowly, painfully, begun to rebuild her relationship with her daughter based on honesty rather than manipulation. Emma's relationship with her mother was healing, though it was different now. Emma had learned boundaries. She had learned that she could love her mother without sacrificing herself. She had learned that her mother's emotions were not her responsibility to manage. These were lessons that therapy had taught her, but they were also lessons that Justice had helped her learn. Justice had continued to play a role in Emma's recovery, though in a different capacity now. The dog was no longer needed as a signal bearer for her trauma. Justice had been gradually transitioned out of his alert dog role and back into his primary role as Emma's beloved companion. But the bond between them had deepened immeasurably. Emma understood that Justice had saved her life in a very real sense, not from physical danger, but from the slow psychological erosion that comes from living under the weight of parental alienation. When Doctor had suggested that Emma could retire from the signal training, Emma had been relieved. The signals had always carried weight, had always been tied to trauma and fear. Now, Emma simply enjoyed Justice's company without the complicated emotional baggage of their therapeutic partnership. At school, Emma had a noticeable transformation. Mrs., her teacher, had mentioned that Emma had begun to participate more actively in class. She raised her hand to answer questions. She initiated conversations with classmates. She seemed lighter, less burdened. The anxiety that had characterized her first grade year had largely dissipated. The case had attracted significant attention in the mental health and legal communities. Doctor had been invited to present her findings at several conferences on parental alienation and the emerging field of trauma-alert animals. She had written a peer-reviewed article about the use of trained dogs in helping traumatized children communicate when their voices had been silenced by fear. The article had been published in a respected psychological journal, and it had generated considerable discussion about innovative approaches to child protection in custody disputes. Judge Harrison had received commendations from child advocacy organizations for his handling of the case. He had used it as a teaching tool in training other judges about the subtle but devastating nature of psychological abuse within custody disputes. He had become an advocate for recognizing parental alienation as a serious form of child abuse that warranted intervention. For the past 6 months had been a period of rebuilding. He had reconnected with his daughter, but he had also had to help her process the trauma of what she had experienced. He had attended therapy sessions with Emma to help her rebuild trust in him and to help her understand that his love had never wavered, even when she had seemed to reject him. He had learned new parenting skills to help a traumatized child heal. Most importantly, he had learned patience with the fact that trauma doesn't disappear overnight, that his daughter would carry the marks of what happened to her for years to come, and that his job was to support her in healing without trying to fix everything or make it all go away. Emma set down her paintbrush and looked at her painting, a picture of a girl and a golden dog sitting beneath a tree, the girl's hand resting on the dog's head. It was a representation of safety, of being heard, of being protected. She had painted it for her therapy homework, as Doctor had suggested creating visual representations of healing and safety. Justice lifted his head and looked at Emma with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to hold all the secrets of her trauma and all the hope of her recovery. Emma reached down and scratched behind his ears, and the dog's tail began to wag slowly. "Thank you," she whispered to the dog, knowing that Justice had given her something that no amount of words could have accomplished. Justice had given her voice when she had none. Justice had communicated her truth when she couldn't speak it. Justice had been the bridge between silence and safety. Placed a sandwich on the table in front of Emma and kissed the top of her head. Emma looked up at him and saw nothing but love and pride in his face. There was no disappointment, no condemnation, no impossible demands. There was simply a father who loved his daughter and was grateful to have her back. That evening, as Emma prepared for bed, she thought about the courtroom and the moment when Justice had stood up and alerted to her distress. She thought about Judge Harrison's frozen face as he realized the truth. She thought about her mother's devastation as her actions were exposed. She thought about the months of therapy and healing that had followed. She had learned that telling the truth, even when terrifying, even when it came through an unconventional method like a trained dog, was an act of courage that could change everything. She had learned that adults could be wrong, that parents could hurt their children even when they believed they were protecting them, and that sometimes you had to speak up even when speaking up felt impossible. As Justice settled onto the foot of her bed, his warm presence a comfort in the darkness, Emma finally felt something she had stopped believing was possible. She felt safe. Not just physically safe, but emotionally safe. She felt protected and seen and believed. She felt like a child rather than a small adult managing impossible adult problems. Outside her window, the stars were beginning to appear in the twilight sky. Inside, in this quiet room with her beloved dog and the knowledge that her father was safe downstairs, Emma drifted off to sleep without fear. The nightmares that had haunted her for so long seemed like they belonged to a different girl, a different time. She was different now. She was healing. And with justice beside her, with her father's love surrounding her, with a court system that had chosen to believe her, Emma was finally beginning to believe that she deserved all of it, all the safety, all the love, all the peace that had been stolen from her by parental alienation, and regained through the extraordinary bond between one brave little girl and a golden dog who refused to let her silence go unheard.